Hello and welcome to today's IES session, which sits within the sixth and final stage on the road to COP as part of the solutions theme. The panel and I will be discussing can we most effectively fight climate change, and we'll focus on adaptation and resilience. I'm delighted to say we have a great expert panel to discuss the topic. So before we get started, I think it's time for some introductions. So my name is Craig Love. I'm a Climate Change and Sustainability Manager within Transport Scotland, and I will be chairing today's discussion. In my current role, I manage a team of officials who oversee climate change adaptation and resilience, corporate climate change mitigation, the circular economy, noise and flooding. I'm also a chartered environmentalist, and my background is in climate change and carbon management. So that's enough about me. I'm now going to invite each of the panelists who could give a short introduction about themselves and their key interests in the subject. So let's start with yourself, Maria.
Hi, Craig. Thank you. I'm Maria Pooley. I am a climate resilience principal consultant. Principal consultant at Mott MacDonald, the engineering consultancy within the environment division. My background is very much in working with design engineering teams and planning teams on identifying climate resilience and adaptation issues and solutions across a range of projects, mainly infrastructure. In recent years, I've had a focus on rail and transport more widely.
Thank you, Maria. Hayley.
Hi everybody, I'm Hayley Warrens. I'm the Climate Risk and Resilience Lead at Transport for Wales. I am the lead for climate change related activities across the whole organisation, working with our engineering teams to ensure that we assess climate risk and ensure that it is embedded into everything that we do. I'm also in charge of developing Transport for Wales's climate change adaptation plan and also its pathway to net zero. I'm a chartered environmentalist, previously worked for local government delivering their climate emergency strategy, and my background is in environmental science.
Fantastic, thank you, Hayley. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks, Craig, and hi to everyone. So I'm Jessica Brislin-Higgs, and I'm a part of the same company as Maria Pooley. We do cross over quite a bit on projects and work together from time to time. So great to see you, Maria, and thanks for having me. So I'm based in South Africa, but I work globally on projects involving urban resilience mostly. So when I joined Mott MacDonald, I was tasked with internal awareness raising and thought leadership to support explaining and to support the understanding of the implications of climate change to our staff, our stakeholders and our clients. That had an external focus, of course, as well as internal. And part of my role has involved developing an internal online e-learning module, which we've just released for all staff. And we're now thinking of rolling that out to clients as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Now, a lot of the discussions ahead of COP has focused on the Paris Agreement and its goal to limit global warming. However, what's probably not discussed enough is that this agreement was also a landmark moment in terms of climate change, as for the first time there was a binding agreement which brought all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and its effects, adapt to its effects. What I personally think is interesting about this is that it's often seen as an oversight. This is reflected by Chris Stark at the Climate Change, who said adaptation remains the Cinderella of climate change, still rags in the stove, under-resourced and often underfunded. So while world leaders are seeking to end catastrophic global climate change through a variety of commitments, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, with further projected changes in our weather systems seen as inevitable. So as we prepare to limit future climate change, preparations must be made through appropriate adaptation and resilience measures. The IPCC defines each of these measures as mitigation, which is the anthropogenic intervention to reduce sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. Adaptation as the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli. and resilience as the capacity of social, economical, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance. So each of these ways to combat climate change are different in their response. However, they're all intrinsically linked. So my first question to the panel is, where do you see adaptation and resilience as a conduit to combating climate change? And how can we raise awareness of the topic? So open that up to the floor.
Well, I think it's absolutely integral, because climate change is going to happen whether we like it or not. The WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, have recently said that in 2020, carbon dioxide levels increased by 2.5 parts per million anyway. And I think there was so much focus in a kind of blasé way that, oh, the pandemic's going to result in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions within the atmosphere. Yeah, possibly, but there is a failure to account for the fact that CO2 remains in our atmosphere for centuries. And what we're paying for now really is our past mistakes. And this sort of, gung-ho approach to industrialization and consumerism, we can't change time. We can't go back. We can't reverse what we've already done. So what we need to do now is ensure that whilst we are obviously striving to limit climate change from worsening to any levels beyond 2 degrees, we also have to have that acceptance. And I think it's absolutely crucial. But also, I think it's a way in which we can actually start to think about, okay, what solutions can we put in place to ensure that they foster mitigation and adaptation as well. So nature-based solutions really offer us a really sort of synergistic way of providing those sorts of solutions, particularly if we're looking at, for example, re-wetting wetlands. By doing so, we provide a solution to reduce the risk of flooding in some areas, but also increase the rate of carbon sequestration as well. So I think there is massive potential. And from my perspective, I think there needs to be more onus from the government for us to be focusing on this, to ensure that our risks are minimized as much as possible, whilst also reducing emissions at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the interesting part there that you said was that we must have an acceptance. Maria, if we were to think about the public in general, how do we convey that message of accepting elements of climate change into their day-to-day when a lot of the messaging that they're potentially receiving is net zero is so key for something they're probably not going to see any benefits of? So
I would agree with Hayley. I've been working since 2006, and climate change resilience has always been the Cinderella, and the focus is more on climate change mitigation, and especially with COP, that's always been the case. And there is a need for a global agreement. I think also that one of the reasons driving this is that in the developed world, we have seen fewer impacts of climate change until, I would say, the last few years. So in 2006, 2008, 2010, if you spoke to someone in the UK and you said, the physics, the laws of physics say that greenhouse gases are already in the atmosphere, and so we are going to see the impacts of climate change, even if we achieve net zero. It was hard for people to visualize that. People jokingly would say, oh, well, a couple of degrees warmer in Scotland, that's no bad thing. We wouldn't mind if it was a bit warmer. I think in recent years, we have seen more and more impacts of flooding, impacts of extreme weather, and we've seen heat waves, certainly in the south of England, 2 summers ago and 3 summers ago, and people have started seeing the negative effects of that. So it's a bit perverse, but the fact that it is actually happening more has helped to increase public awareness of this. The US similarly, it seems you can't go 2 months without some sort of extreme 1 in 1,000 year event happening. It's clearly not 1 in 1,000 year events anymore. So all of that has helped to raise the awareness in public consciousness. From my point of view, we, as a professional in this field, we use that to work with people to help them visualize what the future will be like, and to drive home the fact that there is no reversing. If we exclude geoengineering, which I would personally, there is no going back. And more to the point that, even the COP agreement acknowledges that even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, that is only limiting the effects of climate change. No one ever said that meant there wouldn't be any. It's a case of limiting the worst effects of climate change.
Yeah, and it's that limiting that I think that's maybe not conveyed as much to the public, and you probably don't tend to see that as much on news articles when they're talking about climate change. It's either this is the impact that you're seeing from climate change, or this is how we're going to combat those emissions. Jess, where do you think that the messaging should come from for the public on these limiting effects? Should that come from the government? Should it come from the press? Should it come from science and academia? What would you say would be the best course of action to actually engage with the public on that?
I mean, you almost can't get away from the climate change narrative these days. I almost feel like we've now entered the realm of moving beyond what we know to be happening and what we know to be true. And to quote Dr. David Viner, actually now Prof. David Viner, who Maria will know very well, he said that climate change is not a belief system, it is a scientific fact. And so just changing that narrative from the outset and moving beyond that debate, I think is a really key sort of component to this whole puzzle. But it is a multi-pronged approach that we need going forward. It's incumbent on us as professionals, it's incumbent on governments, it's incumbent on the media, society at large to push this narrative forward and to act. Because there is this dual challenge of we need to decarbonize, but because of locked-in climate change, we need to adapt and be resilient. And it is perverse. We are feeling and seeing the impacts already, and that is certainly pushing this narrative beyond the is it even happening sort of question. So it's getting there, but we do need to boost advocacy and awareness for sure across the board.
I certainly didn't think at 11:22 on a Thursday morning would hear perverse twice before 12 o'clock. So so that two-pronged approach probably leads quite nicely into the next question that I have for you guys. So if we were to consider infrastructure, do you think we can input multifunctionality into solutions at the design stage to support mitigation and adaptation simultaneously? And how do we make sure that those are resilient? Feel free just to put your hand up or come straight in.
Yeah, I definitely think that it needs careful planning, but both mitigation and adaptation can be achieved if at the design stage it's thought through carefully and comprehensively. For example, within development, so new housing developments, for instance, if they explore solutions such as renewably powered microgrids, battery storage, you can create a system whereby renewable energy is used to actually supply the energy to the houses themselves, but also in the event of a power outage in an extreme storm, there is some degree of resilience for a certain period of time because of the microgrid setup. And also my sort of concern, particularly in the work that I'm doing, is from my perspective, I think decarbonisation commitments actually increase our risk of exposure to climate change, particularly with the risk of cascading failures and this increasing reliance on electrification to solve all our problems, to enable us to travel, to heat our homes, for cooking, that's going to put considerable pressure on our district network operators and grid capacity. Thereby, we need to try and enable that we've got the solutions in place to provide backup when inevitably there are going to be large-scale power outages as we go forward. I think at the moment there is a considerable lack of consideration within the decarbonisation commitments to ensure resilience. I think personally they seem to be geared towards capital growth, and I think that they actually do need to step back and have a look to ensure that whatever is being advocated does ensure long-term resilience as well.
Yeah, and that idea of cascading failures as well, I think that particularly in the UK, that's most likely going to impact our rural and island communities because they aren't fed directly into the grid because they're obviously off the mainland. So I think when we look at those cascading failures or the interdependencies, how can we ensure that when we are thinking about designing for the future that they are not left behind? Jess, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it was just a sort of tangential thought that I wanted to contribute here, is that time and time again, it's quite a frustration in our sector, I think, as adaptation professionals, that you can't measure resilience in the way that you can measure levels of mitigation or decarbonisation. And so from the outset, you're almost at a disadvantage trying to prove the benefits of something that may or may not play out and which may or may not reap benefits in future. So we're starting to get creative in Mott MacDonald around thinking of how to quantify potential avoided loss and having that set off against the cost of the actual adaptation measure that you take to prove the benefit of the resiliency. So that's something we're working on day to day with engineers and so forth. And that's an exciting space. But yeah, that was just something I did want to add, because we are at a slight disadvantage in terms of boosting resiliency on projects because of that unknown and the cost element that can't always be proven to be worthwhile.
And I think that comes back to the only way that you know it hasn't worked is if it fails again. And I think that's an unfortunate way for us to work in this sector. Maria, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I'd say the good news is that even though in the public discourse, mitigation and adaptation are very often kept quite separate, at least within consultancy, we are working quite closely together these days. So we work with colleagues in mitigation team when we're working on individual infrastructure projects. We are very much aware that we can, be working at cross purposes if we don't work together from the beginning. And there is an awareness that the old-fashioned engineering approach of, if you will, for example, for flood risk, build build higher, build more, that comes with a carbon cost from a carbon mitigation point of view. So it might be a climate resilience measure, but it has an impact on the mitigation element. So we are increasingly exploring other solutions, and Hayley mentioned nature-based solutions. There's a lot that can be done there in terms of flood resilience solutions, and we are also increasingly trialing a more flexible approach around risk. So rather than just saying, for example, this infrastructure has a lifespan of 100 years, let's build it now so that it's resilient to flood in 100 years. You can imagine how that would end up. That would end up with some fairly significant flood defenses. We can instead say this piece of infrastructure has a lifespan of 100 years, but it has, a refurbishment point after 40 years. So actually, can we think in the first instance about what needs to be done to make it resilient to climate impacts for 40 years, and then we can revisit. We don't have to build and prepare now for the full 100-year lifespan. And that gives you the opportunity to be more flexible. And also in 40 years' time, we might have completely different solutions available to us than we do now.
Yeah, and I think that idea of nature-based is certainly something that I'm seeing come to the forefront more and more as a way to combat the impacts of climate change and the weather-related impacts in particular. one thing that we are doing at Transport Scotland is we have a landslide problem on a piece of land called the Rest and Be Thankful, and what we're using is we're planting a series of trees as a natural binder for the ground there, and we're also looking to function that through the woodland carbon code, because it's obviously going to sequester carbon. It's around about 100 acres. So one of the things that we're trying to do is show within our own agency that if you do this nature-based solution as a way to adapt and be resilient, you also have this carbon sequestration potential there. So you're ticking all three boxes. And I think that's one of the ways that I think it's to break down those barriers of people just purely looking at targets net zero and then the adaptation solutions that we have. I'd be interested to hear of any current projects that you're actually undertaking, if you're okay to share around about adaptation solutions that also look at that sort of mitigation element.
Let me think. First, can I just say, I love Rest and Be Thankful as a name. I went through there earlier this summer. It is brilliant. It makes sense.
You might have been one of the few people that got past.
It makes sense once you get there why it's called Rest and Be Thankful. Sorry, Hayley, you were going to say about
No, I was just going to say at the moment I'm still developing TFW's adaptation plan, and I'm very keen to ensure that a systems-based approach is undertaken. So risk assessments are absolutely integral to identifying the solutions. But I'm particularly interested in what you were saying, actually, Craig. So one of the solutions I have identified as a potential for slowing down the rate of embankment failure or just mitigating it completely is tree planting, because trees, if planted correctly, can actually improve soil suctions at depth. But the only caveat is the risk of high winds and lightning during extreme storms could present a risk of vegetation on the line. So that has to be looked at carefully, hence why what I will be doing is working with the engineering teams to undertake comprehensive risk assessments in the field to ensure that the right solutions are put in place for the right areas, particularly because the area that I'm working in, the Core Valley Lines, is so complex with the upland topography, fluvial systems and microclimates that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and it needs to be bespoke dependent on the particular risk in certain areas.
That's one thing I always think that's really interesting about the railway in general, when we think about the focus we put on that as a means to decarbonise our transport systems, yet we're across the UK we struggle with leaves on the line. It's an incredible issue that still plagues my wife's a train driver, and it's something that she talks about quite often, that when it starts to glide along the track because the brakes aren't working properly, it's incredible that we haven't come up with a solution to that as yet, as we're moving towards a net zero future. So that could be an adaptation solution that you could potentially look at going forward as well. So anyone else, anyone else like to come in on something that they're currently undertaking that's kind of looking at both aspects?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mean, there are two. The one is we've just completed, and the other is slightly more historical. But the one we've just completed was for the city of Addis in Ethiopia, where we came in to do adaptation planning at the urban scale. And we had to identify a series of adaptation actions off the back of their climate risk assessment. Those adaptation actions were co-created with city officials because they knew conditions on the ground much better than we did. And we were working in COVID times and everything was done virtually. But we developed a kind of framework to help us narrow down and to use as a lens for identifying the most beneficial adaptation actions. And we came up with I think a suite of 20 questions that looked at all sorts of co-benefits, including the social aspect of job creation and amenity creation. And one of the most exciting of those adaptation actions was the development of sort of buffered corridors along the rivers, their major river systems. massive, absolutely massive, so much so that they became or will become a kind of tourist attraction for Addis. And of course, there's the carbon sequestration element, but there's also that social amenity creation as well. So that's just been wrapped up. Another one historically was when I was working in local government. We got hold of our stormwater engineering team's capital projects program for the year ahead, and we saw all sorts of bizarre sort of bridge upgrades that they had planned at massive cost. And we had seen some of the ramifications of these big capital projects playing out and what they were doing to wetlands, particularly in the bridge upgrade space. So in one situation, we identified a bridge that was due to be upgraded, and it needed to be upgraded because it was silting up. And we instead proposed that we rehabilitate the wetlands surrounding that bridge at minimal cost. It was literally just staff hours and a bit of soil and plugging of wetland plants, and to just let it play out, let natural selection sort of run its course. And in the fullness of time, about a year later, there was no need for the bridge upgrade. So that was a really cool project. And I mean, I had left local government by then, but it did kind of change the approach that the engineers took going forward to consult in the first instance with the environmental and climate practitioners within their own organization.
That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Maria, would you like to come in as well?
Just briefly, I was going to mention a project that Mott MacDonald's involved in, which is the Leeds Flood Alleviation Project, which is considering a range of natural solutions, which also include tree planting, so would have the dual adaptation and mitigation aspect.
I think that we're all saying that the potential for that dual-pronged approach is 100% there. It's just about getting others to buy into it. So I think it's all about that presentational point of view. And I think the fact that we're sitting here coming from a similar sort of background in the subject, and we'll all have different projects that we're taking forward that are all achieving similar things. I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I've got coming up later on this year is an adaptation and resilience summit for the World's Roads Association, and it's looking at adaptation and resilience in low and middle income countries. It's actually based in Uganda, and one of the things that I'll be presenting on there is on adaptation maturity, and we have a capability framework in Scotland that could be applied to any sort of public body where you can actually baseline how mature you are in your adaptation process. I think that as you said earlier on, Maria, that we haven't really seen the impacts until recently of climate change, yet we have the funds available to try and adapt just now and be more resilient, whereas in these low and middle income countries, they perhaps don't, so they have to be a bit more innovative in the way that they try and address the impacts of climate change. I think as we move forward in this sort of adaptation journey, and we do have that funding available, I was wondering if we can adapt our built environment to climate change whilst also addressing, say, like housing shortages and embedding sustainable design principles. I'll just open that up to the floor.
Yeah, I think that there is a potential to look at the design stage. I think at the moment in the UK, we are ever increasing our exposure to risk because planning policy just hasn't been updated. It's still lagging behind, and there's really no considerable climate change considerations at all. New houses in England are still being built with gas boilers, standard electricity, very sort of building reg standard fabric, no real consideration in terms of orientation, passive heating and cooling ability. So I think that is the key underpinning element, that planning policy needs to be updated first and foremost. But I think really and truly there needs to be careful and considerate design, because I think passive design is really, really important. But also there seems to be this massive program of building new houses, but we do have a lot of redundant houses. In some areas of the UK, you've got streets which are empty. So for me, it just feels a bit nonsensical that we're building new houses and leaving these empty houses. And I just feel that there's possibly a way in which they could be retrofitted, and to ensure obviously that they are also resilient, but to be as low carbon as possible, to try and deliver some of the housing shortage problems that we have, to try and alleviate them. But I think there's also a problem whereby urbanization, particularly in our lowland areas, and this sort of development encroaching particularly into estuarine areas, and building on the floodplain, is just really starting to increase our risk going forward of flooding to those properties, and then displacement. So I think there really just needs to be a shake-up of policy and more strategic thought, not just looking at current flood risk, but future. I think that needs to be embedded really, and to try and, particularly with urbanization, within these areas, it's increasing the risk of surface water flooding. So there could be solutions such as SUDs that are embedded, but again, I think there just needs to be this revolutionary approach to the whole planning system to ensure that housing shortages are delivered possibly by utilising the empty properties that we've got before building new ones which still aren't fit for purpose anyway in a future climate.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point around the houses that are available that we're not looking at. I think, I'm not sure if anyone caught it, but there was an interesting programme a couple of years ago on Channel 4 where there was streets in Liverpool that were lying pretty much derelict, and people were going in and buying them from the council for £1, and then they were upgrading it and paying for it themselves. I think that's a really interesting point, because that sits more with this sort of circular approach that we're trying to embed in the whole country. And I feel like a lot of the times when professionals in this area sit and talk, we use a lot of buzzwords, but that's just because in reality, that's exactly what it is. It's that circular approach, looking at what you've got, why it's not fit for purpose, let's repurpose it and use it. But as you say, I mean, within Glasgow itself, there's so many empty office buildings around the whole city, yet we keep building more and more office buildings. So why not repurpose them as flats or something? I mean, there's definitely something in that. I think that is key to that sort of housing sort of crisis. And if we do it properly, they could be well adapted to the impacts of climate change, because the initial infrastructure is already there. So I think that's a really interesting point. This idea of shaking up policy, I think that's one of the hardest things to do. Particularly, I work in obviously the Scottish government, so influence policy that might not seem sexy or topical is the hardest thing to do. So how do we go about influencing people, Maria, in government to make the changes that we need to see?
I'm possibly not the best person to ask about campaigning, because it's not my natural strength. I tend to go with kind of logic and rational as an approach. I would say yes, absolutely. I see it as a two-pronged thing. One, yes, the current planning policy is, I hate saying this, not really fit for purpose in this area at the moment. So the key driver driving climate resilience is literally just the requirement within environmental impact assessment to consider climate change, which we've had since 2018. I've worked on a number of EIAs, but it is very high level, light touch, and often, to be honest with you, councils don't have the resources to implement in, shall we say, a more aggressive manner. So the developer will apply for planning permission for a new development. Climate change is going to be a long way down the list of priorities that are being considered within the environmental impact assessment. And funnily enough, Hayley, yes, even though we could do better on flood risk management. That's actually one of the better areas, at least at the moment, the way I see it. We do even worse on issues like overheating. And that actually takes me to the other of the two-pronged, which is that we need, I think, a revamp in building design standards and approach. In the UK, we still focus on improving energy efficiency in households, and we do still have a problem with fuel poverty. But at the moment, in new builds, we're focusing on that at the detriment of overheating. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine because I live in a very warm new build house, which, yes, is very cheap to heat in winter, but it absolutely overheats in summer. From a climate resilience point of view, that's just really not good. And there is no driver at the moment, regulatory or otherwise, for developers to consider that. So how do we influence? To go back to your question, which I haven't answered, there's a number of different ways. One could argue that properties that routinely overheat are actually not fit for purpose and unsafe, and could try and pursue developers that way. That's obviously a bit an interesting approach. The most useful thing would be if it did come in a more top-down manner from the government, actually taking a more nuanced approach to what is needed from a climate resilience point of view.
I think it should come from that sort of idea of a top-down approach. One of the things they're trialing in Scotland is a sort of place-based approach around adaptation. So we have around the Glasgow City region, you've got Climate Ready Clyde, we've got Highland Adapt, and some of the things that they're looking at is a combined conduit for a multitude of councils to move forward with adaptation planning together. Is there something maybe in that sort of place-based approach to building standards that could perhaps be taken forward by the councils if it isn't coming from the top down? Jess, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most exciting space is sort of city or municipal planning. I feel like that's really where we're seeing the most action, at least here in South Africa. That's also been boosted by nonprofits like C40 and the Rockefeller Foundation, where they've helped cities partner with each other to share learned experiences of what works and what doesn't, depending on their climate and what hazards could play out. So yeah, very definitely, I think cities are more autonomous and can act quicker than just the pure top-down approach. Top-down approach certainly helps. But we're seeing incredible action here locally in South Africa, in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban. Very exciting space.
I think the difficulty we have here with local planning policy is the fact that it's informed by national planning policy, and they can't amend it. Well, they could. They could put supplementary planning guidance in place, but a developer only has to build in accordance with national planning policy.
Wow.
So then what could happen is the local planning authority could refuse an application because of certain sustainability principles, because they want to set a higher standard, but then the developer will just appeal and the planning inspector will then say, no, it's in accordance with the national planning policy framework. And it just becomes this really vicious circle effect. So yeah, I agree with Craig. And what Maria said earlier, top down, I think is definitely key, but also to devolve more powers to local planning authorities in the first place, to have the freedom. The majority, I think over 300 councils in the UK have declared climate emergencies. So allowing them some autonomy, because they're the ones that know their local areas, that, you know, more than national government, to actually have the flexibility to set the bar higher and request more. But that needs to be, again, driven by national government to allow that to happen.
I think
just nodding lots because currently hobbled by that requirement. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting thought around the 300 councils clearing the climate emergency, and I think climate emergency in this whole spectrum is quite an interesting topic as well, because an emergency in itself is something that we weren't expecting, whereas for quite a long time we've been this has been coming. So it's interesting that the wording that we use with all these things, and I think that when we move forward with however we approach adaptation and resilience, I think that language needs to be key as well when we're talking to people who don't have a background in the subject. But when we're thinking about that top-down approach and how much money has been maybe required for that change, I think if we were to look at the response to COVID-19, particularly across the world, and the money that was put towards coming up with vaccinations and so on, and that was an emergency, we didn't see it coming. So what can we learn from that response to the pandemic that could help us drive transformative change that we need for climate action? Jess, I'm going to start with you this time because I've started with Maria and Hayley the last two.
That's such a difficult question. COVID is very different to the climate change problem we face. I feel like you can isolate the problem more easily and perhaps deal with it more easily than you can climate change. Yeah, I'm going to pass. I honest to God don't know.
Well, what if I word it slightly? What lessons could we learn from that approach then, that was took to that sort of to address the COVID situation, rather than just throwing money at it? What sort of lessons could we look at?
I think working together. You know, there's so much human ingenuity. We've proven that we can rise above these challenges. There are some brilliant minds around the world. We just need to share experiences and knowledge better. And, you know, in the case of the vaccines, I think we could have done a better job when a solution was found and when vaccines were created. Yeah, I think sharing knowledge is the way forward.
I think that sharing of knowledge and joined up approaches and working together is really, really interesting. But as you say, with that sort of vaccine rollout, it was very staggered across the world. And you, in the UK in particular, I think we bought the majority of supply in the first instance. I think what's interesting with that on the run up to COP, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, had said that he expects countries to come with an adaptation solution to the COP and pre-register what they are planning on doing going forward. I wonder if that then could be the sort of catalyst for that more joined up approach, similar to the COVID response, where we do have that sort of joined up approach. We all have a common goal. Hayley, I wonder if that should be the key focus of this COP, rather than just this idea of coming up with a new target globally to reduce emissions.
Yeah, I agree. I think across the world, the strategy to manage the COVID-19 pandemic was just to contain it, close borders, no mobilization, no one go anywhere. It was a global issue completely. It affected everyone from Donald Trump to somebody working in a paddy field in Asia. Everybody was impacted by this pandemic in a similar way. But with climate change, it's a global issue, but the impacts are going to vary so differently from region to region and also on a local level as well. But nevertheless, we cannot just close ranks on this. We need to open up, we need to share, and we need to have a pot of money that is available, particularly to assist those in some of our poorer countries that are going to be the worst affected by climate change and do not have the funds necessary to implement the solutions that are needed. And I think the onus really falls on the big players within G20 to actually put their hands in their pockets and support those particular countries. And I think sharing is going to be absolutely integral. I think we need to start for the benefit of humanity, really. With COVID-19, obviously, it came out the blue, and we had world leaders, thinking, oh my gosh, how do we deal with this? And it was something that they never faced before. But we know that our climate is changing. We have evidence on the table from scientists within the IPCC to indicate what the risks and impacts are going to be. So we have a real opportunity here to collaborate and put long-term thinking behind the planning. Open up the purses, open up the knowledge sharing, and start to help each other, rather than be so reactive in trying to respond to the problems when they actually arise.
And I think that spend is really, really important. But I think, is there an issue with the fact that we are seeing that adaptation is underfunded? It's not at the forefront. So for the UK in itself, if we look at the UK, sorry, I keep touching on the UK, Jess, but if we were to look at the UK, we say that it is underfunded. Chris Stark's saying it's the Cinderella. So if we don't have our own house in order, how do we go about making sure that countries who maybe don't have the finances to combat climate change have adequate funds if we're underfunding it here?
I think that's where COP comes in. I think that's one of the major ambitions of this conference, is to determine that and delineate that and lock it in for the G20 nations to help plug the funding gap.
Thanks. I think what a lot of this discussion is showing that that we have the tools available to make a change, but we're maybe not using them in the way that we should be at the moment. So how do we go about embedding science and evidence into our strategies to improve resilience and adapt to climate change? With a lot of the things that we're saying here, that we have the tools available to make a difference, but how do we actually go about embedding science and evidence into our strategies to improve resilience and adapt to climate change?
Just resourcing the professionals within corporations, within local governments, that actually understand what those climate projections are, and giving them the floor to and ability to work with different departments, such as planning departments, engineers, construction departments. I think that's going to be integral, because what I am seeing, I haven't been in the industry for as long as Maria, for instance. It's only been, a few years, 5-6 years. However, what I have noticed is that there's still so many different corporations and councils, etc., without the resource available to support the delivery of this agenda. And that's absolutely integral. So I've been brought into TFW, and I understand the projections, and they will be underpinning everything that we do in terms of our risk assessments. And the ethos, the Climate Change Committee's recommendation of prepare for 2 degrees, assess the risk for 4, that's going to be underpinning. But unless you have the professionals in-house that understand all that, then those particular projections cannot be disseminated and embedded into policy strategies, etc. And I think there's possibly a potential skills gap that would also need to be addressed by government to try and encourage people to actually work within the field itself.
Yeah, that idea of skills gap and expertise is something that I've found in some of the work that I've been undertaking myself. Some of the more recent job adverts that we put out, we're trying to bring in someone with that sort of geographical or environmental background. And I think that the idea of green jobs is another very, very topical, very, very buzzwordy thing that we see quite often. but how do we move away from just saying green jobs and actually moving forward and getting the right people in place?
I mean, here we actually have a green jobs program in South Africa. It's part of an expanded public works scheme where we deploy thousands of individuals into the field to remove alien vegetation. So that's certainly helping with our unemployment levels, but of course has massive environmental co-benefits, including climate change. So that's a really great sort of example I've seen in action. We've seen entire catchments improve in terms of flood management and resiliency. So that's green jobs in action to me, but there's so many facets and so many ways of couching the term green jobs.
And I think that agenda around green jobs is certainly something that we're seeing in Scotland, with a certain amount of funding going towards that. But I think if you were to look at the mitigation side of things and reducing emissions, when we started bringing into corporate reporting, it tended to fall with individuals who were more around the estates or health and well-being within organisations, or health and safety. Maria, how do we make sure that as adaptation moves further up the agenda, that it's not allocated to people who don't have the relevant skills? And do you think there's something in here about engaging with school children at a very young age so that they actually understand that this is going to impact them more than we see now?
So I would agree with Hayley that there absolutely is a skills gap at the moment, and that we do need people in place with the understanding of climate change projections and what this means. In terms of the children today, I actually feel fairly positive on that front. I think they're much more engaged than we were, 20, 30 years ago. They have an awareness of climate change. It's also slightly depressing for them, which is why we see things like Extinction Rebellion. Sorry, I should rephrase that. It is slightly depressing for I'm only in my 30s, but the younger generation are seeing that climate change is here, it's happening, and that they are going to be the ones most affected by it. And yet often we still have much older people, I don't think there's another way of putting it, in positions of power in government, making decisions which are going to affect the future of younger generations, and sometimes the decisions that they're making don't seem to take into account climate change. I mean, that's the politest way of putting it. So I think we've got the engagement at the school children level. There could definitely be, I don't have children myself yet, so there could definitely be more in the curriculum about it. I think that wouldn't hurt. Yes, and anything that we could do to bridge that skills gap would be very fruitful.
Particularly apprenticeships, because obviously they're now called modern apprenticeships, which are applicable at any age. So enabling people to possibly make a career change, but also outreach to universities, particularly any graduates who have just studied geography or environmental science. That outreach, I think, is going to be really important to actually develop the grad schemes and link up with the universities to actually enable us to fill those particular skills gaps, whether it be at a local government level or within corporations. But I think an apprenticeship scheme which is focused particularly on adaptation would be a real advantage, particularly enabling people as we come out of the pandemic who are perhaps, if they've lost their jobs or for whatever reason, to give people another opportunity to actually embark within this field. Because I think, Maria said there's a lot of interested people, particularly within younger generations. So let's give them the ability to actually work within the field and put that in that inspiration and power into actually delivering real solutions.
And also, as
And
you
I
say,
think
the
that
opportunity to retrain at any stage of career is very useful.
Yeah, that's interesting that you just touched on that point. I myself actually only went to university 4 years ago, and I undertook a master's in carbon management, having never been to university before. But I've been working in that sort of climate sector for about the last 10 years. But as I got more and more into the subject and became more passionate and interested about it, I wanted to learn more. And once you start down that path, you just want to absorb more and more information. But on the graduate program, Hayley, as you work in the government, for the government sector or the public sector, do you find for those graduate programs, it tends to be engineers that they're bringing in for that sort of infrastructure element? Because that's certainly something more that I see within our own agency, is that the focus is on that engineering skill set rather than maybe a graduate environmentalist or someone with a background in geography.
Yeah, so I'm going to be hiring shortly, and I've been really specific within the job description about the particular skill sets that I want, and I'm going to be working really closely with our recruitment team to ensure that we do appoint somebody of the right caliber. But yeah, I definitely, and I think there seems to be trying to resource in-house with what they've already got seems to be quite commonplace. I'd say that was particularly common in local government. I think you mentioned it earlier, Craig, about environmental health professionals doing carbon accounting. That is something that I've experienced working for local government, and bless them, it's not their fault. They're just being dumped this work on their desk and they've just got to run with it. But sometimes it just becomes a sit on the shelf exercise. Nothing is done with that work. So actually, if we do get the right caliber of people in the door in the first place, then that is when we will start to see deliverables actually happen. I mean, myself, similarly to you, Craig, I was a geography teacher up until 2017. I re-specialized, and I was really lucky that I had an environmental science background, but I was also fortunate that somebody took a punt. And I think actually now we need to not have that approach. It just needs to be standardized. I think there needs to be more gravitas behind this as a national agenda to actually have a framework and ensure that our exec boards put in place the policies to ensure that the correct caliber of people are actually employed to do these particular jobs.
This is a question to everyone now. Do you think that there's something, if you look at the Chartered Environmentalist route, you look at membership for the Institute of Environmental Sciences, is there something missing that could give people that climate change badge that would be able to help get people employed who have the relevant skill set, rather than it being a general environmentalist or a member of environmental sciences actually with that key focus on climate change?
Maybe a chartered climate professional. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking. Is there something? Is there a gap there that when, say, you're putting out that job advert, or Mott MacDonald are trying to bring in a new specialist, that's something that you could actually see. You tend to see a member of IEMA or a member of the IES or a chartered engineer or a chartered environmentalist. But again, that's more of a general, maybe it's something that needs to be more focused so that you can turn around and say, well, I know that person has a background in there and they are an exceptional individual in their field. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, so I apologise if that seemed like a curveball question, but it just seems like there's something missing from that point of view.
There's a gap. I mean, I when recruiting, I would caution against being too prescriptive, because we do need people with a range of skills. But having said that, in my experience, there is definitely a gap. As you say, climate professionals tend to be part of the IES or of IEMA, but there is no body representing climate resilience experts. Now, I would really like to see that in the next few years. You know, I'm chartered environmentalist through the IES, and that's great, but it is a general badge and background. And I think that
maybe
there
that's
is
something for
growing
us to
demand
start,
for it.
Maria, tomorrow. We can start looking into that tomorrow. You heard it here first. So we're moving on to just the final question that kind of moves away from that sort of infrastructure element and policy. So this question is a little bit different. So how can we adapt our food systems to changing climates, and do we need behavioural change to be involved in that?
I think there's a potential that as our climate changes in the UK, that particular temperate regions will have the ability to actually grow more anyway. But I think that we need to be more self-reliant on what we can grow ourselves. I think sufficiency really is going to be key to enable us to safeguard ourselves against the pressures on supply chains that we've experienced recently. So, you know, that there was just, it's just outrage across the whole of the UK because supply chains have been affected. But if you were more resilient and able to grow the food for our population ourselves, then it wouldn't be so much of an issue. But I think in terms of behaviour change, we need to be reducing our meat and dairy consumption, not just because of the emissions attached to the agricultural industry, but also because of the vast quantities of land that are needed for pastoral farming. So if we could, particularly if we could free up land to grow more crops, then from pastoral farming, then actually you're providing that resilience as well. But also I think there needs to be a real shift away from this fast food consumerist culture that we're currently living in. You know, if you go into a supermarket, instead of one item of mayonnaise, you'll have 20 different brands. Why do we need that much? And I think really we just need to be strip it back, almost strip it back 50 years, you know, before we were so obsessed with having everything from all around the world now when we want it. I think we need to really start reshaping the way in which we sustain the food for our population. But that is going to be challenging because our population is set to increase through this century. So how we do that really needs some system of systems, holistic thinking to actually enable that to happen.
I think that idea of change and changing the way we're shopping, we've seen that with if you go into one of your bigger supermarkets, so we're not plugging anyone here, but your bigger supermarkets do have those 30, 40 different items. But some of the smaller supermarkets that we're seeing coming from Germany, you go in and that's the products that they are. So if you want a bottle of juice or you want bread, that is the one that you can buy. There isn't as wide a selection, but yet you walk into these shops and they're all really busy. Yeah. So is it something that if we were to try and embed that change in the bigger supermarkets, people would be just as invested because that's just the choice that's there? I mean, I'm certainly starting to notice in shops that certain items aren't on the shelves as readily as they previously were. So, you know, it doesn't really put me off because you just pick something else. But if there's only one thing there, then that's what you're going to buy. What are your thoughts on it, Maria?
So I'm going to agree with Hayley on one point and disagree on a couple of others. In terms of focusing on the UK being self-sufficient in terms of food production, I think that is going to be very difficult. I mean, we haven't been for years. There was World War II is the best example, right? When we tried to be self-sufficient, that was a massive effort. There was rationing, there was grow your own, and the population was how much smaller than it is now. So I think it would be very difficult, and we would need to be careful of unexpected side effects if we were to focus on that as our main policy focus. I think instead, actually, what we're talking about when we're talking about supply chains and being aware of the vulnerability of supply chains, as we have been this year, is that maybe actually having less choice isn't a bad thing. So maybe if instead of 50 products, we have a choice of 2 or 5, and we focus on reinforcing the supply chains for those, maybe that's enough, potentially. I do absolutely agree that we need a focus away from fast food. One of my personal observations is that there has been a massive increase in population, food consumption, food waste, consumption of intensively farmed chicken, for example. Think back 30 years and think now, if you go and find lunch somewhere in London, it seems like everything has chicken in it as a cheap kind of protein filler. Do we really need that? Are the environmental effects of that intensive chicken farming worth it? You can guess I'm going to say no. No, it's not worth it. And then finally, in the run-up to COP, Hayley, you mentioned reducing meat and dairy consumption, and I won't disagree. But when we talk about shifting land use away from, for example, beef and lamb and into arable, a lot of the land in the UK, upland especially, that's being used for that isn't actually suitable for arable. So
that's the difficulty, isn't it?
I think farmers are getting short thrift at the moment, and some of them are actually quite understandably cross. The reason that we have lamb in the Lake District is because it's not suitable for anything else. They tried growing potatoes there during the Second World War, and they did really, really badly because of the climate, because of the soil. So in those circumstances, I think we just need to acknowledge that that actually is the best use of the land at the moment, and that they have a stewardship role, and that there's a lot that can be done to use that land productively, but also maintaining biodiversity and providing ancillary benefits like flood resilience and all sorts of things. So I personally would focus more on reducing food waste within the system than on reducing, for example, meat and dairy consumption. That's just me. I'm going to wrap it up there because I think I've said enough.
Jess, what is the sort of perspective from that sort of sub-Saharan Africa point of view, particularly with temperatures set to further increase? How do you embed that sort of change across that region?
I mean, it's so embedded in our culture as to sort of live off the land. I would say 80% of our population does grow their own crops on their own small holdings. So yeah, I think that's a kind of embedded skill that we have, but we do need to adapt the crops that we're planting. So we are seeing adaptations of maize and sorghum and so forth coming to the fore, and that's all off the back of research and development by scientists locally. So that's gone a long way, I think, to improving food security for the future. Yeah, it's an ongoing area of research and experimentation.
Thanks, Jess. I think I've really enjoyed today's discussion. So I just want to say we're now approaching the end of our panel today. So I would like to invite each of you to set out your final thoughts and one key action that you would like to see come out of COP that can address that adaptation and resilience challenge.
I would like to see equal weighting for adaptation within policy. We've had a very all singing, all dancing net zero strategy that was released by our government. I'd like to see the same for an adaptation strategy. I think there needs to be funding that is devolved to our local governments and more autonomy and more powers to enable them to actually deliver adaptation solutions within their own areas, knowing their areas better than anyone else. And I think really and truly, we need to stop thinking just solely on net zero. And I said it previously earlier in the discussion, we need to accept that our climate change is happening. We need to be aware of those risks, and we need to start thinking now and putting in the solutions in place. But we do need to have that agreement, that finance, that funding, that collaboration disseminating out of COP26 to enable that to happen.
Thanks, Hayley. Maria?
Thanks. Similarly, I would like to see out of COP coming an equal commitment to climate resilience than the focus that we have at the moment on climate mitigation and net zero, and for that to include a commitment to share knowledge and resources, so funding, with developing countries for climate resilience action, not just for reducing emissions.
Thank you, Maria. Jess?
I would like to repeat that exact last sentence that Maria just stated. That's exactly it. We really need to focus on supporting and plugging the knowledge gap to support developing economies. And yeah, to lock in that funding and have a framework on how it's best spent.
Thank you so much, Jess. Well, thank you so much for attending today's roundtable discussion. Sorry if I've stumbled over my words at any point. It's just a habit of a Scotsman, so I do apologise. But thank you so much for joining me today, and I really appreciate you taking your time out for the discussion. I think it's been really worthwhile, and I look forward to hopefully having another discussion with the three of you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Craig.